Roughly 3.5 million years ago, Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, one of the most important fossils ever found, roamed the African savanna. Today, using the latest scientific research, we're going to reconstruct her life and her death as much as we possibly can. From the terrible danger she would have faced, to her greatest moments, and perhaps even the first glimpses of what makes us truly human, this is Life and Death 3 million years ago. Lucy's life began in the same way as all life does, with a bang. She was born into a world that was in many ways familiar to ours, but in some ways vastly different. Millions of years before our species had scarred the planet, this was a wild world, absolutely teeming with life. Some we would recognize as the ancestors of modern animals, others would be quite different, like Therapithecus brumti, a relative of the Gelada but twice the size, weighing up to 50 kilograms. Likely it preferred to eat plants, but you wouldn't catch me getting in the way of one. Meganterion, saber-toothed cats, built like a leopard on steroids with huge teeth and strong jaws to bring down the largest of prey, perhaps most dangerous of all, crocodiles. Many more species than we have now, lurking hidden in the water. For a young Australopithecus like Lucy, life was far from guaranteed, and the archaeological record is full of examples of our ancient ancestors falling prey to these beasts. A Paranthropus, aka robust Australopithecus with 2 puncture marks in the skull, probably caused by a leopard, dragged across the savannah by your skull. Horrible way to go. The bones of thirsty Australopiths, peppered with the puncture marks of crocodile teeth, no doubt caught off guard as they went for a drink, ripped from the water's edge by a crocodile lying in wait. Saddest of all perhaps, the small tongue child, a roughly 3-year-old Australopithecus africanus that lived around 2.8 million years ago. Judging by the marks on the insides of their eye sockets, seemingly plucked from the savannah by a predatory bird, probably an African crowned eagle, and carried away to a grisly end. Lucy, however, survived these challenges, possibly by spending a lot of time still in the trees. Although we're confident Lucy was bipedal from her short and wide hip, a fully extendable knee, and many other anatomical features, her upper body and the upper bodies of other afarensis hominins are more complicated, seemingly retaining many more ape-like features. In 2012, anthropologists found the intact shoulder blade of a young Australopithecus afarensis, which they called Salam. This was a critical discovery because even though Lucy is 40% complete, her shoulder blades are missing, denying us a crucial piece of the anatomical puzzle. Salam's shoulder blades were much more similar to modern juvenile gorillas than modern humans, suggesting that some of their time was still being spent in trees. However, it is also possible that these were archaic features that Australopiths retained from our last common ancestor with chimpanzees, and that they served little practical purpose, changing very slowly due to a lack of strong evolutionary pressures. Apart from avoiding becoming lunch, her childhood was probably similar to modern great apes, playing with other kids, rolling around in the grass, jumping on her siblings, watching the adults in her group, learning the skills she would need to survive. Consistently, probably the greatest challenge Lucy would have faced is finding food. Analysis of the teeth of 20 different Australopithecus afarensis indicates that their diet involved a lot of C4 plants. These are grasses, sedges, succulents, the kinds of plants that thrive in a dry, open savanna environment. They could have been eating the grasses and seeds themselves, or possibly the roots and tubers, which are much higher in calories. Because of their inaccessibility, competition for these buried foods is rare, and it could have provided a decent meal for an Australopith smart enough to dig for them. These foods are almost entirely avoided by our closest relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, and this change of diet marks a significant moment in the direction of our evolution, away from the resources of the forest towards the more varied resources of open landscapes. Just because this food source has little competition, though, does not mean that their life was easy. Teeth from Australopiths that lived 1 million years after Lucy show that they experienced seasonal stress in their diets. Lucy may well have faced similar hardships and likely spent a long time roaming the savannah in search of food. Absolutely stunningly, footprints from Lucy's time have been preserved in the earth for us to study today, called the Laetoli footprints. What's fascinating about these footprints is that recently more have been discovered from the same location that suggest there were different walking styles, different gaits used by hominins at this time. How well Australopiths could walk and run has been a big debate in anthropology, and these different footprints will certainly be analysed for clues to the evolution of our bipedalism. Not only are the Laetoli footprints an incredible relic of ancient human life, they are the literal footsteps of some of our most ancient ancestors, but they're also a reminder that 3 million years ago humanity was very much in its infancy, and there were probably many distinct groups, each subtly different, each with its own specific quirks, survival strategies, and biological adaptations. When Lucy was wandering the earth, though, trying her best not to starve, she almost certainly was not just on the lookout for plants. She probably had a taste for something meatier and had a secret weapon to get it. Many monkeys and apes use tools to acquire food, so it's likely that there has never been a point in hominin evolution where we were not using some form of primitive tools. What separates our lineage, hominins, from our other cousins, though, is the ability to really modify tools and improve them, particularly stone tools. It was believed for a long time that the first modified stone tools were the Oldowan stone tools, created by our genus Homo, specifically Homo habilis, around 1 million years after Lucy had died. However, recently, stone tools were unearthed that date to 3.3 million years ago, right in the ballpark of Lucy's life. These have been dubbed the Lemekwi assemblage and are currently the oldest deliberately modified stone tools ever found. Bones of animals, likely ungulates and bovids, have also been unearthed bearing cut marks from an astonishing 3.4 million years ago. This evidence suggests that Lucy's diet could have been supplemented by quite a bit of meat, and that she was creating tools to access it. This raises some really fascinating questions. First, how did they acquire this meat? Lucy was only about 1 meter tall and was not likely to be a great sprinter, so hunting large and fast animals was probably not easy for her. Could troops of Australopithecines have bullied faster predators off their kills? It's certainly possible. Troops of other primates can be highly aggressive. So aggressive that if Lucy's life was anything like a chimpanzee's, then another major challenge was probably avoiding other Australopiths. Lucy could have also been scavenging meat off carcasses of abandoned prey. Large predators like lions often leave a lot of meat on the bones, and that doesn't even include the bone marrow inside them. Perhaps Australopiths like Lucy were developing stone tools to strip the bones of small slivers of meat, or use them to smash through the long bones to get to the marrow. Instead of competing with top predators, Lucy was probably fending off other scavengers like vultures. The second important question is, what was going on in Lucy's brain? If our interpretation of the evidence is correct and hominins like Lucy were making modified stone tools, then it suggests something dramatic had shifted in the brains of Australopiths compared to other apes. Lucy's brain would have been a similar size to a modern chimpanzee's, just marginally bigger on average. Yet chimpanzees in studies have so far been unable or unwilling to produce modified stone tools, and even seem unable to use a sharp flake to open a box containing food. So even though the change between the two skulls is small, something dramatic was going on underneath. The brains of Australopiths were perhaps being rewired. Another incredible artifact that allows us to get a glimpse inside Lucy's brain is the intriguing Makapansgat cobble. This cobble was found in a cave in South Africa in layers dated to 2.95 million years ago that also contained the remains of Australopiths. Curiously, this rock is several kilometers away from where it would be naturally, perhaps as far as 32 kilometers. It's probably too big to be carried in by a bird in the stomach of a bird, and the cave showed no evidence of flooding that could have brought it in. No one can really deny this rock really triggers that sense within us that likes to find faces, pareidolia. This ability is definitely not unique to us. Chimpanzees process faces in a similar way to humans. Many animals have evolved this sense out of simple self-preservation. Spotting faces ultimately reduces the chances of being bitten by them. It is possible that this rock stood out to an Australopith. That something about the rock said, "Hey, take me home. Let's go back to the cave." Again, suggesting that something was really changing in the brains of Australopiths. This is especially interesting because so far, endocasts of Australopith brains and chimpanzee brains have shown little difference in organization. So the change must have been incredibly subtle, but very significant. Perhaps all of our artistic expression and creativity ultimately has its roots in a simple moment of curiosity by an Australopith like Lucy. Lucy was not simply an upright walking ape. She was taking the first tentative steps towards becoming human. One of the major events in Lucy's life might have been giving birth. This was probably quite difficult for Lucy. The combination of upright walking, which narrowed our hips, and slowly increasing brain size was probably starting to put a strain on pregnant women. Baby Australopiths would have probably had to rotate slightly to pass through the birth canal. This meant that giving birth was certainly harder than it had been earlier in our evolution, and therefore might have become a more collaborative process. Instead of Lucy giving birth on her own, like a chimpanzee does commonly, she could have been surrounded by other women, perhaps her own mother, assisting her in bringing new life into the world. Who knows what effect this increased collaboration had on our evolution? Usually when we imagine increased cooperation in our prehistoric ancestors, we picture them hunting together. But that's just one way we cooperate, and the increasing difficulty of giving birth could have been an extremely significant factor in our evolution, in the evolution of our complex social systems. How much of a role Lucy's baby daddy played in raising children is subject to huge debate. The issue revolves around the size differences between males and females, called sexual dimorphism. In primates, species that have a high degree of sexual dimorphism tend to live in societies where there is one massive guy trying to have all the sex with all the women and play little role in the raising of children. Silverback gorillas and mandrills are two perfect examples. Absolute beasts. Compared to other apes, humans don't have a high degree of sexual dimorphism, and males tend to be very involved in the raising of children. Some studies of Australopithecus afarensis have come to the conclusion that there was a high degree of dimorphism. Others have argued that the degree of dimorphism is similar to humans and that therefore males were more involved in family life. In support of this idea, Australopithecines seem to have developed slower and had longer childhoods than our modern ape cousins. Probably because they might have had to learn how to produce stone tools and live slightly more complex lives. So more investment was probably required from somebody, and that could have been dad, who knows? It's just hard to say for sure because we don't have a perfectly preserved male and female Australopith. So all these estimates are based on reconstructions. The specimens we do have are not only incomplete, but also separated by hundreds of thousands of years. Plenty of time for a species to change. Whatever happened in the twists and turns of Lucy's life, at some point, of course, she died. She's dead, spoiler alert. Judging from the fractures on her bones, some have suggested that she died from falling, though others contend that these fractures could have been caused by large animals. Either way, her death was probably sincerely mourned by her family. Humans, of course, we grieve for our dead. Even chimpanzees grieve for their dead, especially infants, even staying by their side for days. As the evidence suggests that Australopiths might have formed even closer bonds, we can only imagine the pain that they would have felt watching over her body. Little would they know we would still be watching over Lucy more than 3 million years later, captivated by the story she can tell, not just of herself, but of the origins of everyone alive today. Around 50,000 years ago, in what is now Iraq, this Neanderthal, Shanidar I, aka Nandy, walked the earth. Using the latest scientific evidence, what can we say about his life and death, his childhood, his diet, his society, his life-threatening injuries? This is the life and death of a Neanderthal. For all great apes, whether human or non-human, childhood is a time of learning and exploration, but also vulnerability. This was undoubtedly the same for Neanderthals, but sadly so many details are now obscured by the mists of time. For some Neanderthals, childhood was undoubtedly a hard time. Living life as nomadic hunter-gatherers during the Pleistocene, when Earth was colder than it is now, was probably not easy. Food, warmth, and safety were not guaranteed. Stress lines in the teeth of this Neanderthal child from Western France suggest that for certain periods of their childhood, they were under a lot of physical stress, either from illness or malnutrition, possibly a result of having to struggle through a particularly hard winter. The owner of that tooth was luckier than others, though. At Moula-Guercy, the remains of at least 2 adults, 2 teenagers, and 2 child Neanderthals were found, dating to around 100,000 years ago. Sadly for these people, it seems they came to a grisly end. Every bone from this cave is shattered, butchered, cut up, clear signs of cannibalism. All the remains were found against the east wall of the cave, totally disarticulated, mixed in with the remains of other animals. It's entirely possible all of these remains come from one terrible event. How common cannibalism was amongst Neanderthals is difficult to say. It was certainly not a daily event for most. But did Nandy have to occasionally resort to it when times were tough, when no animals could be found, when the last horse had left the valley? It's certainly possible. Life was not all bad though. 80,000 years ago, on what are now the beaches of Normandy, a Neanderthal family lived amongst the dunes, leaving behind bones, tools, and, heartwarmingly, little handprints and footprints. Of the 257 prints recovered, the majority belonged to children and adolescents, the youngest being probably around 2. We just can't help but imagine how this family played in the sand. Did the children collect shells, leaving us a tiny handprint as they knelt down? Did their older brothers and sisters yell at them to keep up? Did the 2-year-old hold on to their mother's hand as they tentatively tiptoed on the shifting sand? And what did they think of the wolf following behind them? We're so fortunate to have even the smallest clues of family life preserved for 80,000 years. They're a handprint, a footprint, they're always so special. For our young Nandy, at some point he must have had to learn how to survive in this Paleolithic world of his. He no doubt had to learn how to produce the stone tools that were so essential for life in the Paleolithic, patiently learning how to nap and break rock. He would have had to learn how to process game and cook meat over the fire to provide for his hungry family. Finding such traces of children's journeys into adulthood is hard, but not impossible. Over in Cova Negra in Spain, 244 bird remains were recovered from a layer dating to the Pleistocene, mainly doves and choughs, many of them clearly butchered and burnt. Not only does this show that Neanderthals were adept at catching small prey, but the tiny scratch marks on these bones could have been made by tiny Neanderthal fingers. Perhaps they were thrown a bird to practice on as their mum and dad butchered the rest of the meal. Unfortunately for our Nandy, he led a long and painful life. In fact, he's got to be a contender for the most injured person ever found archaeologically. At some point, he received a terrible, debilitating injury to the right-hand side of his body. We'll never know how, of course. Did he chase a mountain goat too far and fall from a great height? Was he pushed, Perhaps. Whatever the cause of this injury, his right arm was absolutely shattered. It did heal, but in doing so became withered and small. He also completely lost his right forearm. He survived this injury, and we can only speculate how. The pointed angle of the surviving bone has left anthropologists to wonder, was he the world's first successful amputation? The fact that the bone had healed in this deformed state does show that he survived for a long time after this injury. How was Nandy able to prevent himself from dying from blood loss? How did the others around him prevent that from happening? Perhaps in the same incident, a blow to the left-hand side of his face crushed his skull and deformed his eye socket. This almost certainly resulted in him being blind in one eye, or at least having some difficulties with that eye. He had a healed fracture in his foot, injuries to his leg and knees, which probably caused him to walk with a limp. Separate to all of these injuries, he was also struck on the head again, hard enough to deform his skull. And if all of that wasn't enough, he was also partially deaf. Bony growths within both ears certainly caused some form of hearing loss. This could have been caused by the blow to the skull, or he could have had a congenital condition called dish. We'll never know for certain the order these injuries were sustained in. What we can say for certain, though, is that there is no way he could have survived all of this on his own, especially the loss of his arm. Others must have cared for him, brought him food, given him the care and time needed to recover. Nandy went through an awful lot in his life, especially for a time with absolutely no painkillers. You can't help but wonder if Neanderthals used local plants or mushrooms in some way to dull the enormous pain he would have felt. Intriguingly, one Neanderthal from El Cedron in Spain was found to have the bark of poplar wood in the plaque in their teeth. Poplar does naturally contain salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. So, there is some tentative evidence that Neanderthals used plants in their environment as natural medicines, as natural painkillers. However he managed to cope. It's so interesting that what is perhaps evidence of horrific violence amongst the Neanderthals, all these injuries and problems he had, is also the best evidence of their humanity, their kindness, loving each other, caring for each other. In spite of all of these injuries, he seemingly lived until he was around 40, and the rest of his body is robust and sturdy as any other Neanderthals, suggesting he adapted to his condition and lived a physically active lifestyle. Perhaps he learned some one-handed napping techniques. Considering when he lived, he almost certainly had no choice but to continue on, and nothing else to do about it. However, he may have been spared the most difficult of hunts. When we picture Neanderthals, we often imagine them at the height of the Ice Age hunting woolly rhinos and mammoths, and for sure some did live like that. 125,000 years ago, Neanderthals in Germany were hunting straight-tusked elephants, each weighing up to 11 tons, or even more. Huge beasts, a huge amount of food, and an incredible display of Neanderthal hunting and teamwork. For our Nandy, though, he was probably not used to such Ice Age conditions. Although we're still trying to reconstruct the environment around Shanidar Cave at the time Nandy lived, it seems that the climate was probably not wildly different to how it is today. Perhaps Shanidar Cave and its surrounding environment would be immediately recognizable to him. Nandy's meals were also made of less intimidating prey than mammoths, at least the meals he enjoyed at Shanidar anyway. The majority of faunal remains from the cave are made up of wild goats, who still clamber up and down the mountains of the region. How did Neanderthals hunt such nimble prey? Did they lie in wait on well-trodden paths, or hurl spears and rocks at them from above? Can't have been that easy. The fact that goats make up such a large percentage of the remains also gives us a possible insight into when Shanidar Cave was occupied. Still today, shepherds guide their flocks of sheep down towards the Shanidar Valley to overwinter before moving them higher into the Zagros Mountains in the spring. It's interesting to think that the ebb and flow of Nandy's life might have been similar. Winter at Shanidar, spring and summer higher in the mountains. It's certainly possible. Nearby in Syria in the Al Kaum Basin, the tip of a flint spear, still embedded in the neck bone of a wild ass, has been found by archaeologists, possibly ambushed on its way to seasonal lakes that dot the area. Such a large animal would have provided a good meal for Nandy and his family, but it wouldn't have sustained them for too long. Neanderthals were stocky, broad-chested folks living extremely active lives, perhaps even needing to eat 15% more calories than modern humans. In challenging cold climates, they may have needed 7,000 calories a day. For a family of 10 Neanderthals, that would equal roughly 3 reindeer a week, quite a big ask. Such large calorie requirements meant Neanderthals could not have been fussy eaters at all. No doubt all the fattiest, richest parts of the body, the brains, the tongue, organs were all widely consumed. But they probably didn't turn their nose up at humbler prey too. Grubs, insects, things like that covering their prey, found under logs, would have made a great snack for a hungry Nandy. The more we study Neanderthals, the more we realize that their diet was not just meat. Another Neanderthal found in Shanidar Cave, Shanidar 3, had the plaque of their teeth analyzed. Far from relying on goats and asses, the plaque revealed he ate a diet rich in fruits like date palms and wild seeds and grasses like vetch. Such tiny seeds are notoriously time-consuming to gather, and the process must have been a major investment of time for Nandy's community. It's easy to think of this extra calorie requirement as a strictly logistical problem. But this increased need for calories would have had a ripple effect throughout all Neanderthal society. Was it hard for Nandy's mother to gather enough food to feed herself and breastfeed her hungry babies? How did Neanderthal women deal with this challenge? How did Neanderthals picture their landscape and assess whether there was enough resources for them all? And is it possible that this increased need for food played a part in their ultimate downfall? Did leaner, more efficient bodies expanding out of Africa have an advantage in hard times? The more we learn about Neanderthals, the more evidence we have of their adaptability. From turtles to mussels to hibernating bears, everything was on the menu, and they produced a variety of tools to get this food. Not only do we have all the stone tools that they left behind, but every now and again, when conditions are right, we get glimpses of their ingenuity. Neanderthals in Italy were using beeswax mixed with conifer resin to stick their spear points to shafts, warming the mixture over the fire before applying it to their tools. They were really doing prehistoric chemistry, and they no doubt helped themselves to some honey whilst they were at it. One of the biggest gaps in the archaeological record is the fact that wood decomposes. We're largely ignorant of all the wooden artifacts that Neanderthals would have created, but every now and again we do find some. From Abric Romani rock shelter in northern Spain, a wooden tool left a trowel-shaped impression in the dirt. Are these the fragmentary remains of a Neanderthal kitchen tool or a small shovel? From Porghetti Vecchi in Italy, the remains of 58 digging sticks have been found. Nandy and his group must have produced similar tools to help them gather all the plant foods they were eating. And most famously of all, the Schöningen spears, which date to around 380,000 years ago, probably made by very early Neanderthals, found amongst the butchered remains of horses, no doubt ambushed by these Neanderthals. More recently, an intriguing wooden object, believed by some to be a throwing stick, has also been found. This also dates to around 300,000 years old, and it's tools like this that probably allowed Neanderthals to hunt small prey like birds. Most of what we know about Neanderthals comes from cave sites. Just because they're so geologically stable, not much really comes in and disturbs them. But Neanderthals certainly moved outside of these rock shelters. Just finding clues about how they lived and survived when they were out in the world is so tricky. At La Folie, France, archaeologists have unearthed what they think was a Neanderthal camp. A ring of small post holes surrounded evidence of Paleolithic life like flint knapping, butchering, and cooking. All the activities were carried out at different spaces, and this shows that Neanderthals had a very developed sense of space. They weren't just mindlessly bumbling around. We see this elsewhere too at Kibara in modern Israel, where the rubbish of daily life is organized into middens. And at Al Salt in Spain, we have evidence of Neanderthals burning their poo. They didn't want to leave that lying around the cave. Very house proud of them. At Abric Romani again, it's even possible that there's some evidence of Neanderthals creating lean-tos and things like that inside of the cave to provide extra shelter. I'm sure if more wood survived to the present day, we would absolutely be amazed at what Neanderthals were capable of and how they created tools to live in their environment. All of this clearly shows that Neanderthals had the ability to inject meaning into their environment. They're very house-proud. It makes you wonder, what did Nandy think about Shanidar Cave after a long goat hunting expedition? Was he excited to see it? Was he relieved to be sat around the warm hearth of his home? I certainly think so. The ability of Neanderthals to inject meaning into things was not purely practical and definitely entered the realm of art and symbolism. At 170,000 years ago at Bruniquel in France, Neanderthals walked 336 meters through the dark, cold, wet cave into the main chamber. Here, they constructed a ring of stalagmites, and within this circle, they burnt small fires on top of little piles of stalagmites. If the dates and our interpretation of this site are correct, it undoubtedly forces us to question exactly what was going on in a Neanderthal's brain. This is really incredible stuff. And yet evidence for Neanderthal art doesn't end there. From Krapina in Croatia and Grotte de Rennes in France, we have evidence of Neanderthal jewelry made from talons and teeth. From 2 sites in Spain, we have evidence of Neanderthals mixing pigments in seashells. And incredibly, at 3 sites, also in Spain, the possible remains of Neanderthal painting. The faint remnants of a hand stencil from Maltravieso. Red ochre staining the cave wall at Ardales. And most incredibly of all, a panel of strange symbols at La Pasiega. All of these paintings seemingly predate the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe by 20,000 years. So Neanderthals must have made them. Incredibly, at La Pasiega, these newly arriving Homo sapiens may have even added to the Neanderthal scene by drawing animals inside the panels. What did these paintings mean? What happened in the fires of Bruniquel? Why explore deep into these caves? One hypothesis is that they were drawn deep into caves to hunt hibernating bears, which we know Neanderthals certainly did. And once down there, their imagination took over for some reason. We'll never know for sure, but it's certain proof that there was some sort of spark behind those large Neanderthal eyes. The stereotype of mindless brutes eking out a meager existence is permanently relegated to the past. We don't yet have any evidence of art from the Shanidar region, but they certainly displayed a level of symbolic thinking in how they disposed of the dead. As Nandy and his family were walking over the hills, pursuing goats, gathering grains, they undoubtedly ran into other humans. Some would have been Neanderthals like them, but some were not quite the same. At between 40 to 55,000 years old, Nandy lived during, or even after, the time period that a group of Homo sapiens left Africa, at least according to our current understanding. As we now know through genetics, when our ancestors came into contact with Neanderthals, they mated with them, had children with them. You have Neanderthal DNA within you now. Considering the fact that all non-African people have this genetic legacy, it must have occurred soon after this group left Africa. It therefore almost certainly happened in the region of Western Asia. Though to be clear, modern African people do also have Neanderthal ancestry, just less than non-Africans. In other words, Nandy lived at close to the time and in the exact place where our 2 lineages merged for perhaps the last time. The Neanderthal genes that live in your cells could well be his, or at least belong to other Neanderthals that lived around Shanidar. Neanderthals are not our evolutionary cousins, they are in a small way our direct ancestors. In one sense, it's easy to imagine that these 2 groups running into each other was a novel event, that it was unusual for them. But more and more we find that interactions between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals was complex, occurring many times throughout our evolution. In the same way that we have Neanderthal DNA in our blood, Nandy certainly had the DNA of Homo sapiens flowing through his. It really shows that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals are not really 2 distinct species, but rather points on a spectrum of humanity. Nandy really was every bit as human as you or I. The fact that we have Neanderthal DNA within us today shows that they were similar enough to have children, with Homo sapiens, and more importantly, that these children were successful enough in their communities to pass on their DNA too. So I'm sure at some point these interactions between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were peaceful. At least some of the time they must have been. But other times they may not have been. Shanidar III, the individual with all the plant remains in his teeth, had a vicious cut to one of his ribs. It had begun to heal, but the tip of the weapon may still have been lodged inside as the rib seemingly healed around something. And unlike Nandy, who survived for years with his terrible injuries, Shanidar III was not so lucky. They probably died within a few weeks of receiving this blow. Why was he stabbed like this, and who did it, we'll never know. But it's possible that it was conflict between these two groups of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, that this expanding group of humans were not necessarily the friendliest of neighbors. Certainly the rest of human history would seem to prove that point. For Nandy, life seemingly came to an unfortunate end too. Even though he survived injury after injury, poor vision, deafness, and missing arm, there is some evidence to suggest he finally died in a cave-in, crushed by the very rocks that had sheltered him during his hard life. Shanidar Cave is still well known for rock falls today. It's a dangerous place to excavate. However, his story may not quite end there. When Nandy was originally excavated in the 1950s, the idea that Neanderthals would bury their dead was highly controversial. But now, after 70 years more research, it does seem that Neanderthals engaged in mortuary behavior, including simple burials. The Neanderthals at Shanidar Cave are one of the best examples of this. The original excavator Selecki believed he had found the remains of one Neanderthal when he was excavating, lying on its side in a sort of fetal position. As he prepared to remove the body for study, he discovered the remains of 3 other Neanderthals were in the exact same spot, so close that the bones had become mixed up. The chances of 4 Neanderthals dying accidentally in the same spot seems highly unlikely. They were almost certainly placed there. To try and get to the bottom of this puzzle, in 2017, archaeologists returned to Selecki's trench to see what else they could find. As it turns out, there was yet another burial in that spot that Selecki had missed. These bones were found in a bowl-shaped depression, possibly even with their head placed resting on a stone. Great evidence of deliberate burial. The dirt surrounding the body is especially dark, suggesting it's made up of decomposing material. Part of this was undoubtedly the soft parts of the body, but it does also seem that there are plant remains also mixed into this brown spot. Selecki had believed that the burials at Shanidar had flowers placed over them. This was a highly controversial statement for the time, and it has been debated ever since. The discovery of a new burial at Shanidar, again suggesting some form of organic matter placed around the bodies, has reignited this argument about Neanderthals and burial. Did Neanderthals cover the dead with flowers? Did they place goods in the grave? This new burial also seemingly had a flaked stone in their left hand when they were placed into the ground. Was it a prized possession? Did the Neanderthals place it in their hand out of some vague notion that they would possibly still need it? The mind boggles at the possibilities. I'd love to tell you more, but at the time of recording, this research is still ongoing. It would not surprise me one bit if our Nandy had been buried. It's not guaranteed, of course. Neanderthals can die in accidents just like we can. But considering the effort that these ancient humans went into caring for Nandy during his life, it would not surprise me in the least that they would have cared for him in death too, preserving him for tens of thousands of years and giving us an insight into the incredibly difficult but also rich and loving lives of our Neanderthal ancestors. Europe 27,000 years ago, the height of the last ice age. Vast glaciers cover much of the continent. What land isn't buried under glaciers has become a mixture of forests, steppe, and tundra, home to huge beasts such as woolly rhinos, cave lions like this little chap who would have grown into the Ice Age's apex predator, cold-adapted hyenas, and of course many animals we would recognize today. Most impressive of all though, mammoths, the giants of this Ice Age grassland. kings and queens of the steppe. Within this icy world, perched in a cave overlooking what is now the Mediterranean Sea, lived a young man, Il Principe, the prince, so called because of the lavish nature of his burial. Entombed for millennia with hundreds of shells, an exotic flint blade, long-lost medicine perhaps, mammoth pendants, and some mysterious tools. Today, using these objects buried with our prince as an anchor, as well as the latest research from other contemporary sites across Europe, we're going to reconstruct as far as possible the life and death of this Paleolithic prince and the lives of people who lived around 27,000 years ago in what archaeologists call the Gravettian period. Despite the harsh environment they lived in, humans were living rich lives full of ritual, symbolism, and creativity, though of course, the dangers of their world were ever present. This is Life and Death at the height of the Ice Age, the life and death of a Paleolithic prince. Let's start with the body of our dear prince. When he died, he was a young man, a teenager, probably not older than 15, 16, 17. I wouldn't be surprised if he was considered a young adult by those around him, but he was not long out of childhood. Our survival ultimately depends on a huge amount of cooperation, social complexity, and technical knowledge, especially during the challenging climate of the Ice Age. It's impossible to be born with those abilities, to be able to talk and create tools. These have to be learned over time, over a childhood, over a whole life, really. Finding traces of children in the archaeology of the Ice Age can be difficult, but not impossible. Children were loved by their parents as they are now, as we see in the occasional child burials such as Schungir and Kremsvaktberg, and they had items that children today might recognize. What you're looking at on screen is possibly a Paleolithic child's toy. Each side of the disc shows a deer in a different position, one standing, one laying down. Of course, it's impossible to say exactly what the disc was used for. However, this could genuinely be as close as Paleolithic people got to cinema. Imagine it hanging from a string, spinning. It's arguably the same idea behind the earliest animations. Each side of the disc representing a different action, a different narrative. Many of the human and animal figurines from the Paleolithic could also have been children's toys. On the back of the Venus of Dolny Vestanice, which dates to around 29,000 years ago, there are seemingly subtle traces of a child's fingerprint. So presumably, a child must have been present when the clay was still soft, perhaps watching it be made, quickly giving it a poke whilst their mum's back was turned. When we compare human and animal figurines from the Paleolithic to modern examples of traditional children's toys, there are a lot of similarities. It's entirely possible some were toys, some were dolls, though considering over 200 human figurines have been found from the Paleolithic, they probably had more than one use. It's not just toys that Paleolithic children have left behind though. We can see evidence of their activity in the most entrancing of Ice Age relics, cave art. In my opinion, by far the most magnificent and iconic relic of our prehistoric ancestors are the handprints they left in caves around the world. Africa, Spain, France, Indonesia, Australia, even as far south as Argentina. They're just such an elegant and beautiful statement. I was here, I existed. The desire to leave our mark, literally and metaphorically, is just so human. I think we all feel that to some extent. Children were present when this art was made, even creating some themselves. Archaeologists can naturally get a sense of the age of the artist from the size of the handprints themselves. In some caves, such as Fuente de Salín on Spain's northern coast, as many as 27% of the hand stencils were probably made by children. Judging from the heights of some of these small handprints, a child could not have reached them on their own. They must have been held by an adult, by their parents, artists side by side, creating the art that was so symbolic to them and intriguing to us. What a stunning image of prehistoric life, parent and child leaving an impression for us to gaze at tens of thousands of years later. Such a beautiful moment captured. From Basura Cave, just along the coast from Arena Candida, the resting place of Il Principe, archaeologists have found 14,000-year-old preserved foot, hand, and knee prints of an entire family outing, pressed into the mud as they crawled their way 400 meters deep into the cave. Based on the size of the foot and handprints, it seems there were 2 adults, possibly a teenager, 2 children, and maybe even a dog. When they reached their destination deep in the cave, the adults left their handprints on the ceiling, whilst the children amused themselves rubbing their fingers in the clay. What compelled this family to crawl 400 meters through a dark, cold, wet cave? We'll never know. It must have been deeply symbolic though, crawling so far, guided only by small flames, deep into the cold darkness of the cave. It would have been an incredibly intense experience. Although this specific example occurred about 10,000 years after the prince's life, it is again a brilliant reminder that families were creating much of the Paleolithic art we find. Children could be heard playing in the shadow of the lamplight. Children gazed in awe at the art and the animals. We can imagine that the prince's childhood was similar. He no doubt played with the toys of his age. He probably was an artist in his own right, perhaps falling asleep with red, stained hands after a long day exploring caves, listening to stories of animals, gods, and spirits that are now long forgotten. He would have played games that anchored him in this Ice Age world and prepared him for the challenges ahead. Il Principe was buried with a small pendant of mammoth ivory strung around his left wrist. What it meant to him exactly, we don't know, but some believe it to be a stylized form of female figurine. Whatever it meant, it is certainly a sign of mammoth hunting. Perhaps it was a token of a hunt he participated in himself. Standing over 3 meters tall, weighing up to 6 tons, with tusks that could grow as long as 4 meters, these giants of the steppe must have been formidable prey for Il Principe and his group. Tantalizingly, offering the opportunity to feed entire communities, provide a huge amount of bone and ivory for tools, huge amounts of fur, maybe even shelter, but conversely, also the chance to be seriously wounded or even killed. Hunting these animals must have been a major event, and the archaeological record is full of clues as to how our Ice Age ancestors did this. One mammoth in particular is especially illuminating. From the very northern edge of Siberia, butchered mammoth peeked out of the permafrost. At 45,000 years old, it is significantly older than the prince, but it's too interesting not to discuss. Not only is it the oldest direct evidence of humans in the Arctic, but also, crucially, its excellent preservation gives us a fantastic insight into how these beasts were hunted. The hunters have surrounded the mammoth. On either side, they hurl their spears at the mammoth's chest, cracking through bones on their way to vital organs, their points snapping off in its ribs. Bleeding and terrified, the mammoth becomes weaker. One hunter, perhaps determined to show their bravery, comes in close and drives their spear through the shoulder. The mammoth collapses. Dodging the huge tusks of the flailing mammoth, a hunter approaches and drives his spear in a downward blow to the cheek, which was probably aiming for the nasal opening. The base of the trunk was often targeted by traditional groups of elephant hunters in Africa because it can cut major arteries and cause fatal bleeding. This blow could have only been delivered when the animal was already down, the final strike to put him out of his suffering. Although the images might be somewhat disturbing to us now in our modern world where we're so keen to preserve wildlife, we have to remember that the prince living at the height of the Ice Age absolutely had to hunt to survive. He probably could not pass up the opportunity for such a huge amount of food. A dead mammoth equaled warmth, shelter, and full stomachs for his entire family. If the paintings of prehistoric animals are anything to go by, the people of this time had a profound relationship with the animals around them. This wasn't just mindless butchery. During the Ice Age, entire communities relied on the hunting of mammoths, killing them on such a large scale that they were able to construct houses out of their bones. The largest example found so far coming from Kostenki, modern Russia. There, 25,000 years ago, hunters built a 12.5 meter enclosure from the remains of at least 60 mammoths. This building would have taken considerable effort to construct. Killing that many animals, butchering them, moving and piling the bones. It was almost certainly a massive job for a large number of people. Inside this enclosure were the remains of burnt bones, flakes of stone from napping, burnt seeds, typical activity for Paleolithic hunters. Yet the amount of artifacts is actually relatively low. So despite the size of the building, despite the amount of effort it took to produce, was it even occupied for long periods of time? It seemingly had another purpose. Perhaps it was a monument. Maybe it was some sort of meeting place just used periodically. Sadly, we just don't have enough evidence to answer that intriguing question at the minute. The shallow Bechva Valley in what is now Moravia, eastern Czechia, evidently also provided the perfect spot for a community of mammoth hunters. At a site called Przedmosty, the remains of more than 1,000 mammoths were found, the vast majority belonging to young females, suggesting that they were selectively targeted by the hunters. Perhaps their relatively smaller size and youthful inexperience made them easier prey. 20 human burials were also found, and we know from these graves that the hunters of Przedmosty were helped in their mammoth hunting endeavors by a new and particularly fluffy technology. Over 4,000 canid bones were excavated at this site, many belonging to what appear to be wolves, but some apparently not. 3 skulls in particular were much shorter than would be expected for wolves. In fact, they don't match any wolf skull ever found. They were almost certainly Paleolithic dogs. Other skulls were not quite like wolves, but neither quite like dogs. These were possibly hybrids, perhaps the offspring of recently captured wolves. Not quite a wolf, but also not yet a dog. Their association with the hunters of Przedmosty is unambiguous. These weren't just hanging around the edge of camp. Some were recovered alongside human burials, some had their teeth deliberately modified, one example had a mammoth bone placed in its mouth before burial. The evidence is clear, this was a community of mammoth hunters who were in the process of domesticating wolves. When we consider the profile and age of mammoths found at the site, perhaps the dogs and wolves helped the hunters to separate the young mammoths from the herd, chasing them down mile after mile along the valley's edge, wearing them out and making them easy prey for the hunters to finish off. Our prince did not have any canid remains buried with him, so we can't say if he had a dog. However, he certainly lived during this early period of dog domestication, and who knows, he may have had a few curious wolves hanging around the edge of his camp. Despite his mammoth pendant, he also did not seemingly live in a community of dedicated mammoth hunters. Living close to the Mediterranean, the prince was at the very edge of their distribution. Unless he migrated north at times, in all likelihood, they were a rare sight for him. Further south, in marginally warmer climates, fish and marine animals were a regular meal for the prince. According to research, 20 to 25% of his diet came from marine resources. So you would be just as likely to find him wading in the shallows, fishing, or gathering shellfish than hunting mammoths. Analysis of grinding tools excavated in Italy from this time period also shows that the roots of cattails and acorns were being turned into flour. If they were making flour, then simple breads cooked over the embers of the campfire were probably on the prince's menu. So even though the hunting of mammoths is, of course, dramatic and exactly what we picture when we imagine the Ice Age, on a day-to-day basis, the prince's diet was probably much more humble. Fish, nuts, small game, roots, the smell of bread cooking over a fire, filling the air as he chatted to his family. Our prince was buried with a particularly beautiful flint blade nestled in his right hand. At 23 centimeters long and just 1 centimeter thick, it's a real work of craftsmanship. The stone came from the region around Forcalquier, southern France, over 200 kilometers away as the crow flies from the prince's resting place. If this object was gathered by the prince's group and not traded for, then collecting it must have involved a journey of several weeks, and it gives us an idea of the range that Paleolithic hunters would travel to acquire tools. This blade shows no evidence of use, and considering the distance it had traveled and the fact he was buried holding it tightly, it was probably a very special grave good. Naturally, good quality stone was essential to the prince's survival. Gravettian hunters frequently made long, thin blades with straight backs, almost certainly designed as inserts into composite weapons. One particularly well-preserved find comes from just along the coast from our prince. It seems that the flint blades excavated were attached to a piece of bone, probably glued. This whole piece would have presumably then been hafted onto a spear. Perhaps it was designed this way so the bone snapped off in the animal, leaving all those flint blades inside. The working of flint would have been second nature to Gravettian hunters, an absolutely necessary skill to survive in their world. So it's not surprising they would choose to bury a loved one with a particularly beautiful and prized blade. Another object buried with the prince that is very intriguing though are the batons de commande, aka perforated batons. These objects are found throughout the Upper Paleolithic right down to the early Mesolithic, a span of well over 10,000 years and a huge geographical spread across Europe. Over 400 examples have been excavated. Typically made of antler, they consist of a shaft with a hole drilled into one end. Some can be highly decorated, particularly later examples, but the princes are more humble, adorned with simple lines. Many theories have attempted to explain what purpose these objects served. Spear straighteners, badges of office, they're very enigmatic and hard to understand. However, recent research has given us a small clue. Judging from the wear patterns on batons from Gough's cave in Britain, it seems that they were worn down by something passing through the hole. The owners of the batons would cut grooves around the hole to perhaps adjust the passage of the object that was traveling through it. The archaeologists believe a rope was most likely. Apparently, 70% of batons are broken across this perforation, suggesting this area was being put under huge strain. Antler is very strong, it doesn't break easily. Engravings along the shaft of some also suggest that perhaps humans might have needed to maintain a tight grip on them. So it does seem that these objects had some practical purpose. Perhaps to help hold up shelters when the prince's group was out in the wild. It could have functioned as a spear thrower with a rope providing the extra force needed to launch the weapon. Maybe even conceivably as some form of harness, either for humans or, considering what we know about dog domestication at this time, maybe even possibly a dog sled. Who knows? Whatever their role, they must have been very important. They were used for thousands upon thousands of years across a huge area. They were important enough that the prince was buried with 4 of them. If people in the Ice Age were anything like modern hunter-gatherers, hunts were undoubtedly accompanied by rituals. Asking the spirits for good fortune or forgiveness or negotiating the death of an animal. The prince must have participated in such activities. All societies have rituals. One possible clue to the rituals of his day could be his very clothes. His head was covered in hundreds of shells and deer canines. Perhaps a hat, perhaps a mask, perhaps they were braided into his hair. He had a large necklace of shells that culminated in a large cowrie. He was wearing pendants around his arms and legs. He was really buried with a lot of jewelry, hence his nickname, Il Principe. Imagine the noise these objects would have made as he danced. Such elaborate personal ornamentation could have been highly symbolic for the prince, not just because of how they looked, but because of how they sounded. From the prince's time and earlier, many flutes or whistles have also been found, frequently made out of the long bones in birds' wings. So despite the harsh conditions, cold climate, his world was probably full of music, singing, and dancing. We can imagine their whistles and the rattle of these shells echoing across the tundra. Sadly, the nature of so much of the prince's life has been obscured by time. What rituals he participated in exactly are basically impossible to know. Are some of the female figurines that they love to produce representative of a lost system of beliefs? Fertility symbols, maybe? We'll never know. Although I have to say, they didn't just produce representations of women. Are the markings on the bodies of these figurines representative of tattooing or scarification? It's certainly possible. The marks on these objects were deliberately made, and body modification is extremely common in human societies. During the Gravettian, in fact, there is possibly evidence of a much more grisly form of body modification. Several caves in modern France and Spain during this Gravettian period have some really unusual handprints. Handprint after handprint, seemingly missing fingers, missing joints. At Gargas Cave in France, of the 231 hand images, 114 are missing at least one finger segment. Cosca Cave, of 49 hand images, 28 are missing parts of fingers. Milosavljevich in western Spain, 61 of the 71 hand images are missing fingers. All in all, over 200 examples have been found, all from the Gravettian time period, all from France and Spain. These fingers naturally could have been lost accidentally. This was a cold time. People get frostbite and lose fingers. But so many hand images with missing fingers may be a sign that they were deliberately removed. This may seem like a bit of an exaggerated claim by some archaeologists, but it is actually a well-documented phenomenon. One study identified 121 societies from around the world that participated in deliberate finger amputation. The Dani of Indonesia remove part or all of their fingers when they have lost a loved one as a part of their mourning rituals. The Blackfoot in North America would occasionally cut off a finger as part of the sun dance ritual if they were asking the sun to save or protect a life, and a particularly large sacrifice was required. The Ila-speaking people of Southeast Africa would amputate fingers as a punishment for crimes like adultery and theft. Australian Aboriginals from around Port Stephens would cut off 2 joints of the 5th finger to identify their daughters as fisherwomen. So the ethnographic record is full of examples from all around the world of this practice being carried out for a variety of reasons. The creators of these handprints could have cut them off deliberately as they mourned or performed rituals or identified themselves, either by their trade or their community. However, some also argue that these handprints are representations of silent hand signals used by hunters, or that they are some form of counting system. We can naturally never know for sure. As far as I'm aware, the prince is not missing any fingers. He was spared that pain, but sadly he was not long for this world. Unfortunately for the prince, he died a violent death at a young age. Part of the left side of Il Principe's mandible is missing, indicating he was struck down violently. We don't know how he died. He could have died as a result of a hunting accident, struck in the face by a Goliath of the Ice Age, or perhaps he was attacked by another person in some violent confrontation over who knows what: love, jealousy, resources, power. Perhaps he was the aggressor and struck down in self-defense. He might not have been a nice guy. This wound had evidently begun to heal, but it was too late, and the prince died. The people that buried him covered this hole in his jaw with yellow ochre, maybe out of some desire to send him into the next life complete and whole. Or maybe this was medicine to them. Maybe they had packed the wound with ochre in an attempt to heal it. Whoever buried him, presumably his family, placed him in a shallow grave lined with large stone blocks and sprinkled red ochre over the body. Around his arm, the pendant of mammoth ivory, the unused flint blade from so far away grasped tightly in his hand. 4 batons for some unknown purpose. His elaborate clothing. It's a very lavish burial. Despite this, and his nickname of Il Principe, we shouldn't assume that he was literally a prince to his community. We have no evidence to support that idea. Most people want to give their loved ones a good farewell, whatever that means to their society. We shouldn't necessarily assume that his lavish burial equals a strong social position. He could have simply been loved, buried with the treasured artifacts of his time, keeping him company for over 27,000 years and providing us a window into the world of this Paleolithic prince.